A man moves into an upscale apartment, but encounters subtle but unrelenting prejudice from a power-hungry couple, forcing him and the community to confront the prejudice hidden in their seemingly perfect world. How many prejudices are there in us and in our lives, and how do we deal with them? Let's find out together. You'd think life would slow down once you've made it. Once you've ticked all the boxes, career, home, comfort, you expect a certain quiet to settle in. That's what I thought when I moved into Riverstone Tower, one of those shiny new condos that sit on the edge of downtown like a promise of something better. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a rooftop garden, and the kind of polished marble lobby that whispers wealth. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the noise of my old life and find something close to peace. But peace is a tricky thing. It doesn't come just because you've paid for it. Sometimes the past follows you. Sometimes the chaos is waiting just around the corner. That's what I'd learn on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day that makes the city look like it's melting. The clouds hung low, casting everything in a dull, silvery light. I'd spent the morning in back-to-back calls for work, my brain numb from the endless loop of metrics and performance reviews. By lunchtime, I needed an escape. So, I grabbed my jacket and headed for the lobby, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The encounter, I didn't notice them at first, the couple by the elevators. I was too busy scrolling through my phone, absently checking emails as I waited for the concierge to finish helping someone at the desk. But then I heard it, a sharp, clipped voice cutting through the quiet hum of the lobby. "Excuse me, can we help you?" I glanced up. The voice belonged to a woman, mid-40s, with the kind of sharp features that made her look permanently unimpressed. She was standing beside a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored jacket that screamed money. His face was set in a polite but firm expression, the kind of look people use when they're asking questions they already think they know the answer to. At first, I thought they were talking to me. But then I saw who they were looking at, a man standing by the mailboxes flipping through a stack of envelopes. He didn't look up when they spoke, his focus fixed on the papers in his hands. That only seemed to irritate the woman further. I said, "Can we help you?" she repeated, her voice louder now. The man finally looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. He was young, maybe mid-30s, with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of quiet confidence. He wore a dark leather jacket, slightly damp from the rain, and carried a black messenger bag slung over one shoulder. "Sorry," he said, his voice calm but slightly puzzled. "Were you talking to me?" "Yes," the woman snapped. "We were just wondering what you're doing here." The man blinked, clearly taken aback. "I live here," he said, holding up one of the envelopes as if to prove his point. The woman's eyes narrowed, her gaze darting to her husband, who was now frowning as well. "You live here?" she echoed, her tone dripping with skepticism. "In Riverstone?" "Yes," the man said again, his voice a little firmer this time. "Is that a problem?" The husband stepped forward then, his hands tucked into his pockets. "We've just never seen you around before," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something colder. "And we like to keep an eye out for unfamiliar faces." Unfamiliar faces. The words hung in the air like smoke, and I felt my stomach tighten. I wasn't sure what bothered me more, the assumption behind the words, or the way they were delivered, as if they were doing the man a favor by questioning his presence. The man didn't flinch. If the comment bothered him, he didn't show it. Instead, he pulled out his phone and held it up, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. "Well, if you're so concerned," he said, his voice steady, "I can show you my lease." The couple exchanged a glance, the woman's lips pressing into a thin line. It was clear they hadn't expected him to push back. They'd expected him to apologize, to shrink away, to disappear. But instead, he stood there, meeting their gaze with quiet defiance. Before they could respond, the concierge, Ralph, stepped forward. Ralph was one of those unflappable types, the kind of guy who could stay calm even if the building was on fire. He looked between the couple and the man, his expression carefully neutral. "Is everything all right here?" Ralph asked, his tone polite but firm. The woman turned to him, her eyes flashing. "We were just asking this gentleman what he's doing here," she said. "He claims he lives here, but—" "He does," Ralph interrupted, his voice cutting through her sentence like a blade. "Mr. Carter moved in last month. He's one of our newest residents." For a moment there was silence. The couple stared at Ralph, their expressions a mix of surprise and irritation. Then the woman cleared her throat, straightening her shoulders. "Well," she said, "it's just, you can never be too careful these days." The man, Mr. Carter, let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Careful," he repeated. "Right." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the elevators, his bag swinging at his side. The couple watched him go, their faces taut with discomfort. When he disappeared from view, the woman muttered something under her breath and stalked off, her husband following close behind. Reflections in the aftermath. I stayed in the lobby longer than I needed to that day, replaying the scene in my mind. There was something about it I couldn't shake, the tension in the air, the way the couple had looked at Mr. Carter as if his very presence was a threat, and the way he'd stood his ground, calm and composed, even as their words tried to cut him down. It wasn't the first time I'd seen something like that. Living in the city, you learn pretty quickly that some people carry their assumptions with them like a shield, ready to pull it out whenever they feel uncomfortable. But something about this felt different, more personal, more deliberate. And as I left the lobby and stepped into the rain, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if Ralph hadn't stepped in, if Mr. Carter hadn't had his phone, his lease, his proof. What would they have done then? That night, I couldn't shake the scene from my mind. It replayed in flashes, her sharp tone, his steady calm, Ralph's swift intervention. It wasn't just what they'd said, but the way they said it, the way their questions weren't really questions at all. They were accusations dressed up as concern. I'd seen it before, of course. Who hasn't? The subtle shift in someone's posture, the carefully measured words that hide a storm of judgment underneath. But there was something about seeing it so up close, so blatant, that made my stomach churn. The rain continued to pour outside, tapping against the windows of my apartment like a persistent question. Why hadn't I said something? I'd stood there, watching it all unfold, and done nothing. Maybe Ralph's intervention had been enough, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like I'd let something slide past me, like I'd failed to take a stand when it mattered. And then there was Mr. Carter. I didn't know anything about him, not his first name, not what he did, not why he'd chosen to move into Riverstone. But I knew what I'd seen, the way he'd held his ground, refusing to let their assumptions define him. It wasn't anger that drove him, at least not the loud kind. It was something quieter, something stronger. I poured myself a drink and sat by the window, watching the city lights blur through the rain. What was it he'd said? Careful, right? 2 words, but they carried so much weight. Sarcasm, sure, but also resignation. Like he'd been through this 100 times before and knew exactly how it would play out. And maybe that's what bothered me the most, that he had to know. The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the city washed clean and glistening in the sunlight. I headed down to the lobby, intending to grab a coffee from the cafe on the corner before diving into another day of meetings. But as I stepped out of the elevator, I saw him again. Mr. Carter was standing by the mailboxes, his head tilted slightly as he scanned an envelope. He looked different in the daylight, more approachable maybe. The sharp edges of last night's confrontation had softened, though there was still a quiet intensity about him. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach. But then he glanced up and caught my eye, offering a polite nod. It was enough to push me forward. "Hey," I said, stopping a few steps away. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened yesterday, with those people." His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't look surprised. Yeah, I said. "And I don't know. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to apologize," he said finally. "It's not your fault." "I know," I said, "but still, it wasn't right." He shrugged, slipping the envelope into his bag. "It happens." That simple statement hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just the words, but the way he said them, matter-of-factly, like he'd accepted it as an inevitability. "It shouldn't," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment I thought he might argue. But instead, he just nodded. "You're right," he said. "It shouldn't. If you like the story and would like to support the channel, please subscribe to the channel and tell us what country you are watching from." Over the next week, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Little cracks in the pristine facade of Riverstone Tower. It wasn't the building itself. It still shone with the kind of polished perfection that came with steep HOA fees. It was the people. The quiet glances, the hushed whispers, the unspoken hierarchies that seemed to divide the residents into invisible categories. I saw it again in the gym when Mr. Carter walked in to use the treadmill. Two women paused their conversation as he passed, their eyes following him with thinly veiled curiosity. I saw it in the parking garage, when he stopped to load groceries into his car and a man in a Tesla slowed down to watch as if expecting something to happen. It wasn't outright hostility. That would have been easier to call out. It was subtler than that, woven into the fabric of daily life in a way that made it almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. But I was looking now, and I didn't like what I saw. It was a Saturday afternoon when I saw them again, the couple from the lobby. They were standing by the concierge desk, talking to Ralph, their voices low but intense. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told the story. The woman was gesturing toward the elevators, her face tight with frustration, while the man stood with his arms crossed, nodding in agreement. Ralph, to his credit, looked unimpressed. He kept his tone polite but firm, his posture unyielding. Whatever they were asking for, it was clear he wasn't going to give it to them. When they finally walked away, their faces flushed with annoyance. I couldn't help myself. I approached Ralph, lowering my voice as I asked, "What was that about?" He glanced at me, his expression carefully neutral. "Just some residents airing their concerns," he said. "About Mr. Carter?" I guessed. Ralph didn't answer, but the slight tightening of his jaw told me enough. "They're unbelievable," I said, shaking my head. "They're not the first," Ralph said quietly. "And they won't be the last." That night, I found myself standing outside Mr. Carter's door, my hand raised to knock. I wasn't sure what I was doing or why, but something about the situation felt unfinished, like I'd been watching a storm brew from a distance, and it was time to step into the rain. When he opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to cautious curiosity. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," I said. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." He raised an eyebrow. "You're checking in on me?" "Look, I know we don't know each other," I said quickly, "but I've seen how people have been acting around you, and it's not okay. I just thought, if you needed someone to talk Tito." He studied me for a long moment, his gaze sharp but not unkind. Then, finally, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "All right," he said. "Come in." Inside Mr. Carter's apartment, the air felt different, not oppressive, but quiet, grounded, the kind of space someone creates to breathe. A dark leather couch faced a low wooden table stacked with books and magazines, a faint smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. It wasn't lavish like some of the other condos I'd seen in Riverstone, but it was deliberate. Every piece of furniture, every detail, seemed like it had been chosen for a reason. "Nice place," I said, stepping inside. "Thanks," he said, shutting the door behind me. He motioned toward the couch. "Make yourself comfortable." I sat, unsure where to start. Now that I was here, everything I'd planned to say felt inadequate. How do you tell someone you're sorry for something you didn't even do? "You said you wanted to check in," he prompted, sitting across from me. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, studying me like he was trying to figure out what angle I was working. "Yeah," I said, clearing my throat. I've been noticing things. How people treat you, the looks, the whispers. And I guess. Wanted to make sure you were okay." His eyebrows lifted slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might laugh. But instead, he leaned back, his gaze flicking toward the window. "You don't have to do that, you know." "Do what?" "Carry other people's guilt," he said, his tone calm but pointed. "I've been dealing with this my whole life. I don't need anyone feeling sorry for me." "It's not about feeling sorry," I said quickly. "It's about justice," he cut in, his eyes locking onto mine. "Equality, making things right?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Look," he said, his voice softening, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, really. But you're not going to change the way those people think. They've already made up their minds." "Maybe," I admitted. "But that doesn't mean it's okay to let it slide." He studied me for a moment, then sighed. "You really want to know what it's like?" he asked. "Living here?" I nodded, feeling the weight of his gaze. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you. If you like the story and would like to support the channel, please subscribe and leave a comment. I'd be very pleased." Mr. Carter, Aaron, as I learned his name was, didn't start his story with anger. That's what surprised me the most. He started with facts, laying them out like pieces on a chessboard. "I grew up in Hartsfield," he said. "Small town, nothing fancy. My parents worked their asses off to give me a shot at something better. He talked about his mother, a teacher who spent her evenings tutoring kids who couldn't afford extra help, and his father, a mechanic who never once complained about the grease under his nails. They taught him the value of hard work, of doing things the right way even when no one was watching. I got into publishing almost by accident, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I was editing a friend's manuscript in college, just as a favor. Turns out, I had a knack for it. That knack turned into a career. After graduation, he landed a job at a small publishing house, working his way up from intern to senior editor. Eventually, he broke out on his own, founding a boutique firm that specialized in spotlighting marginalized voices. I built something I'm proud of, he said, but it doesn't matter how much you achieve. To some people, you'll always be that unfamiliar face. His voice didn't waver, but I could feel the weight behind his words. The exhaustion of fighting a battle you didn't start. The frustration of proving yourself over and over, only for people to pretend they hadn't seen. A few days later, the whispers turned into action. I overheard it in the lobby, the couple talking to another resident in hushed tones, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch the gist. He's been here less than 2 months, the woman said, her tone sharp. And already there's been issues. What kind of issues? The other resident asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. People coming and going at all hours, the woman said. Loud music, strange visitors. It's disruptive. It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. But the way the other resident nodded, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern, made my stomach turn. The couple wasn't just spreading rumors. They were planting seeds, letting them grow into something bigger. That evening, I knocked on Aaron's door again. When he opened it, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. They're talking about you, I said. Spreading lies. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked resigned. Of course they are, he said. That's how it starts. What are you going to do? I asked. He shrugged. What can I do? They haven't filed a complaint. They're just talking. That's enough, though, I said. Enough to turn people against you. Aaron leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. Welcome to my world. It didn't take long for the whispers to escalate. A week later, a notice appeared in the lobby, a request for residents to attend a meeting about community standards. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Neither was the fact that the couple was leading the charge. I showed up to the meeting, determined to stand by Aaron. The room was packed, tension hanging thick in the air. The couple stood at the front, their polished appearances masking the venom in their words. We've all noticed certain odd patterns, the woman began, her voice sweet but firm. And while we want to maintain an inclusive environment, it's important to address concerns before they become bigger issues. Aaron sat near the back, his face impassive, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched into fists under the table. He didn't speak, didn't defend himself. He didn't need to. The couple's accusations were thinly veiled, but they didn't have proof, not yet. When the meeting ended, I caught up to him in the hallway. That was a circus, I said, my frustration boiling over. Welcome to the show, he said, his voice dry. The turning point came a week later. One of the other residents, a young woman named Claire, approached me in the elevator. Have you seen this? She asked, holding up her phone. It was a video, grainy but clear enough to recognize the scene. Aaron standing in the parking garage, being confronted by the couple. Their voices were raised, their accusations flying fast and loose. You don't belong here, the woman said, her voice shrill. I pay my rent like everyone else, Aaron replied calmly. Do you, though? The man sneered. Or is this one of those charity cases? The video ended abruptly, but the damage was done. It spread through the building like wildfire, forcing people to confront what they'd been ignoring. When I showed it to Aaron, he sighed. This is why I record everything, he said. It's the only way to protect myself. The video didn't just expose the couple. It forced the building's residents to confront their own complicity. For weeks, they'd let the whispers grow unchecked, treating Aaron like an outsider because it was easier than questioning their assumptions. Now, with the confrontation laid bare, there was no hiding from the truth. The fallout started small, apologies murmured in the hallway, sympathetic nods in the lobby. But Aaron wasn't interested in apologies. He'd seen it before, the way people rushed to absolve themselves once they realized they were on the wrong side of a story. It's not about me, he said when I brought it up one evening. It's about them. They don't want to change. They just don't want to look bad. We were sitting on his couch, the low hum of jazz filling the silence between us. The video had gone viral within the building, but Aaron had refused to comment on it publicly. Instead, he'd thrown himself into his work, using every free moment to finalize a new deal for his publishing house. "They're trying to save face," I said, "but that doesn't mean it's meaningless." Aaron shook his head, his expression grim. "Meaningless or not, it doesn't change the fact that those two are still here, and they're not going to stop." The next major development came in the form of an announcement. The couple had filed a formal complaint against Aaron, accusing him of disruptive behavior and threatening the community's integrity. It was laughable, of course, but it forced the building's HOA board to hold an official hearing. The hearing took place in the conference room on the top floor, a sterile space lined with glossy wood panels and leather chairs. The couple sat at one end of the table, their faces carefully composed. Aaron sat at the other, his expression calm but unyielding. The board members asked questions, their tone neutral but edged with discomfort. It was clear they didn't want to be there, forced to mediate a conflict that had spiraled far beyond their control. "What specific behaviors are you referring to?" one of the members asked, her pen poised over a notepad. The woman cleared her throat, glancing at her husband before answering. "It's not just one thing, it's a pattern. Late-night visitors, noise complaints, suspicious activity." "Do you have evidence of these incidents?" the board member pressed. The woman hesitated, her confidence faltering. "Not exactly. But we've noticed." "Noticed or assumed?" Aaron interjected, his voice steady but cutting. "Because, if you're going to accuse me of something, you'd better have more than your imagination to back it up." The room went silent. The couple exchanged a look, their polished facade cracking under the weight of his words. The board ultimately dismissed the complaint, citing a lack of evidence. But the damage had already been done. The hearing had forced everyone to pick a side, and the couple's accusations had only strengthened Aaron's resolve. In the weeks following the hearing, more stories about the couple began to surface. It turned out they had a history of complaints, petty grievances filed against other residents, disputes over parking spaces, arguments about noise levels. They weren't just targeting Aaron. They were targeting anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. I started digging deeper, curious about their motivations. What was driving them? Why had they singled Aaron out so aggressively? It didn't take long to find answers. A few conversations with other residents, a quick search online, and the pieces began to fall into place. The husband, it turned out, was a mid-level executive at a failing investment firm. The wife had once been a rising star in real estate, but her career had stalled after a series of bad deals. They'd moved into Riverstone to project an image of success, but behind the scenes, they were struggling to keep up appearances. "It's not about me," Aaron said when I told him what I'd found. "It's about them. They're scared of losing what little power they have, so they lash out at anyone they think is a threat." The tension came to a head one Friday evening. Aaron had organized a small gathering in the rooftop lounge, a chance for residents to meet and discuss ways to improve the building's sense of community. It was a bold move, given everything that had happened, but Aaron was determined to show that he wasn't going anywhere. The couple arrived late, their presence casting a shadow over the room. They didn't speak, didn't engage. They just stood near the door, watching with thinly veiled disdain. As the evening went on, the conversation shifted toward inclusion and equity. Residents shared stories about their experiences, their struggles, their hopes for the future. It was raw and honest, and for a moment, it felt like the building might actually change. But then the husband spoke. "All this talk about community is fine," he said, his tone measured but cold. "But we have to be realistic. Not everyone belongs in a place like this. We have standards for a reason." The room went silent. All eyes turned to Aaron, who sat at the center of the table, his expression unreadable. "You're right," Aaron said finally, his voice calm but firm. "We do have standards. And those standards should be about how we treat each other, not about who we think deserves to be here." The couple's hold over the building crumbled after that night. Their words had exposed them for what they were, small-minded, insecure, desperate to hold on to a sense of superiority they no longer deserved. Aaron, meanwhile, became a central figure in the community. Residents rallied around him, inspired by his resilience and his refusal to back down. The building began to change, slowly but surely, as people started to see each other as neighbors instead of strangers. The couple moved out a few months later, their reputations in tatters. No one mourned their departure. As for Aaron, he stayed. He continued to build his publishing house, turning it into a powerhouse for underrepresented voices. And though he never said it outright, I could tell that Riverstone had become more than just a place to live. It had become a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that change is possible, even in the most unlikely places. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much started with a single moment in the lobby. A sharp comment, a quiet defiance, a choice to stand up, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. I still live at Riverstone, though it feels like a different place now. The walls are the same, the marble floor is just as polished, but the air is lighter, freer. It's not perfect, it never will be, but it's better. And Aaron? He's still there too. Still fighting, still building, still proving that the strongest change comes not from anger, but from persistence, from the quiet, unyielding belief that we can be better than we were. If you like the story and would like to support the channel, please subscribe and leave a comment. I'd be very pleased.